There's been a claim circulated through the internet about the Rothschilds supposedly owning the Vatican ever since extending loans to the Vatican in the early 19th century. The original propagator of this theory seems to have been popular anti-Semitic writer Eustace Mullins, who in his book Curse of Canaan made the claim that, quote, the following year, 1823, the Rothschilds took over all of the financial operations of the worldwide Catholic Church, unquote. As will be seen in this video, the Rothschilds did not extend loans to the Vatican until 1831 to 32, so this unsourced claim made by Mullins is not only inaccurate, but most importantly, the reasoning on which it hinges to suppose that the Rothschilds own the Vatican is incorrect, as it is ignorant of papal history and the papacy's dealings with the Rothschild family, and further, it misrepresents and omits information concerning the loans. The acclaimed New York Times best-selling book God's Bankers by Pulitzer Prize nominee Gerald Posner, published in 2015, contains many relevant refutations, which we will now review, and which will verify the following 4 points. Number 1. During the time of the loans, the Rothschilds did not have financial control over the Vatican, the Pope, or papal policies, and the popes were always financially independent of the Rothschilds with regard to fiscal policy and spending. Number 2. The debts owed to the Rothschilds by the Vatican were consolidated and were on schedule to be paid off after the balancing of the papal budget, at which time the Vatican bypassed the Rothschilds in selling their debt, and moreover, in 1870, all debts of the papacy were dissolved after the Papal States were conquered by Italy. Number 3. The popes were always politically superior to the Rothschilds. And number 4. The Vatican later implemented their own financial methods to handle paying expenses, thus entirely eliminating its need to borrow from the Rothschilds. To begin, regarding the date of the first loan, we read on page 12 of God's Bankers, quote, by the time Gregory XVI, the son of a lawyer, became Pope in 1831, the situation was so dire that he felt compelled to do something remarkable. He borrowed money from the Rothschilds, Europe's preeminent Jewish banking dynasty, unquote. So we see that Mullins' date of the first loan is wrong. This can also be confirmed on the Wikipedia page titled Rothschild Loans to the Holy See. Now, as concerning the Rothschilds and the papacy entering into relations, page 12 of God's Bankers continues, quote, James de Rothschild, head of the family's Paris-based headquarters, became the official papal banker. One of his brothers, Karl, who ran the family's Naples branch, began traveling to Rome to consult with the Pope. Most traditionalists who referred to James as the leader of international Jewry were appalled that the Church had to resort to Christ killers for financial succor. German political writer Karl Ludwig Born noted that a wealthy Jew kisses the Pope's hand, whereas a poor Christian kisses the Pope's feet, unquote. Here we see a Rothschild obliged to kiss the hand of that Antichrist and man of sin in an express oath of fealty. Karl Rothschild was later knighted after proving this obedience to the See of Rome, as is also read on page 12 of God's Bankers, quote, Church leaders may not have liked the Rothschilds, but they did like their cash. Shortly after the first loan, the Pope bestowed on Karl the Medal of the Sacred Military Constantinian Order of St. George, unquote. Next we see that the papacy at times outrightly refused to pay the Rothschilds without consequence, and further, it declined to enact any of the financial reforms suggested by the Rothschilds, which would have better enabled the Rothschilds to collect their debts. From page 13 of God's Bankers, quote, when the Papal States fell into debt, the Pope sometimes simply repudiated the obligation and refused to pay. It was little wonder that the number of countries or banks willing to loan to the Church had shrunk. Still, the Vatican rebuffed all financial reforms the Rothschilds suggested, unquote. Gregory XVI, who took out the initial loans from the Rothschild bankers, died in 1846. His successor Pius IX was driven from Rome in 1848 by a coalition of liberals as well as nationalists fed up with popish tyranny. Pius IX continued the papacy's dealings with the Rothschilds. By this time, there was a backlash within the Jewish community against the Rothschilds because of the perception that the Rothschilds were selling out the persecuted Jews in Italy for their own profit. Posner explains on page 15 of God's Bankers, quote, "The Rothschilds, meanwhile, were criticized by some Jewish leaders who felt as though the family simply profited from the church without making any effort to change its harsh policies toward Jews. So the Rothschilds tried leveraging their influence to beseech the Holy See to improve conditions for the 15,000 Jews in the Papal States. They asked that the Pope cancel extra taxes levied solely on Jews, the prohibition on taking property from the ghettos, and the ban on working in professions, and that he abolish onerous evidentiary standards that put them at tremendous disadvantage in court cases. Pius sent a written assurance to the Rothschilds through the papal nuncio in Paris that he would help. Privately, he told some of his aides that he preferred martyrdom to acceding to the Rothschild requests. Pius ultimately made only a single concession. He tore down the walls and chained gates that ringed Rome's notorious Jewish ghetto, the last in Europe set apart by a physical boundary. But it had no practical effect, as Jews were prohibited from moving anywhere else," unquote. Thus the Rothschilds were politically inferior to the papacy, with their requests for Rome to relent in its harsh treatment of ordinary Jews having been denied. Moving on, it is seen that the outstanding Vatican debt was consolidated into a single loan, after which time the papal budget was balanced by Secretary of State Giacomo Antonelli. It is further noted that the papacy opposed the Rothschild demand that the real estate of the Vatican serve as collateral, again demonstrating the order of political superiority in the Vatican-Rothschild relations, with the former clearly ranking first. From page 16 of God's Bankers, quote, "Pius bristled at the Church's dependency on the Rothschilds. So did prominent Catholic bankers like the Belgian André Lagarde de Monceau, who declared it shameful to borrow money from the Jews. Church leaders believed Jewish financiers were Freemasons, part of a large international effort to destabilize the Vatican and push a secular philosophy in which worship of money replaced that of God. To make the Church less reliant, Pius appointed a deacon, Giacomo Antonelli, as his Cardinal Secretary of State, roughly the Pope's Prime Minister, as well as Chief of the Papal Treasury. He negotiated with the Rothschilds to consolidate some of the Vatican's outstanding debts into a single 40-year loan. It was for a then staggering 142,525,000 francs, around $30 million, some 40% of the Church's outstanding debt, at a 5% interest rate. Antonelli proved as a tough negotiator as James Rothschild. He resisted the bankers' demands that the Vatican's extensive real estate serve as collateral. In 1859, with the new loan in place, Antonelli balanced the papal budget for the first time since the start of the century." Unquote. On the point of the Vatican's debt consolidation, see also Money and the Rise of the Modern Papacy, Financing the Vatican 1850 to 1950 by John F. Pollard, published on Cambridge University Press, page 29, quote, "In 1857, he, Antonelli, succeeded in consolidating all of the various debts and loan accounts of the Papal States into a single debt to be redeemed in stages by 1901, unquote. The Secretary of State was eventually able to dissociate the Vatican from the Rothschilds with a successful fundraising plan, as we read on pages 16 to 17 of God's Bankers. Quote, "Antonelli soon devised a plan to entirely bypass the Rothschilds. The Church would sell interest-bearing debt directly to the faithful without using an investment bank. 2 Catholic newspapers offered the chance to test his do-it-alone proposal. In 1861, the Vatican bought the Jesuits' fortnightly La Civiltà Cattolica to Rome, and it purchased L'Osservatore Romano, a paper that became reading in far-flung Catholic communities. Besides general articles about faith, Antonelli crammed both papers with appeals for donations. The cash that came in was double his target. The Pope approved the sale of future debt without the Rothschilds," unquote. And, Quote, "Free of the Rothschilds, it was not long before Pius rebuilt some of the wall around Rome's Jewish ghetto." Unquote. Perhaps most importantly, in 1870, all debts of the papacy were dissolved after the Papal States were conquered by Italy. We read from the Black International, 1870 to 1878, The Holy See in Militant Catholicism in Europe, page 147, by Emile Lamberts, published on Louvain University Press. Quote, "The Ouvre would only free itself completely from this financial bondage in 1870 with the disappearance of the Papal States and consequently of papal debt." Unquote. As a finishing aside, there was quite an irony of events to these Rothschild loans to the Vatican. As I've written about before, citing primarily the work of leading scholar of Italian history David Kurtzer, the Jesuit La Civiltà Cattolica journal was most integral to the birth and continuance of the modern anti-Semitic movement, which focuses on alleged Jewish political and financial domination as opposed to medieval anti-Semitism, which concerned the Jews' hostility towards the Christian religion. Here are some of my write-ups that you may wish to read on these developments. Here is one of many excerpts from the Jesuit journal about the Rothschilds, coming from a Civiltà Cattolica article published in 1890, page 394, which spreads the superstition of an international Jewish conspiracy centered on the Rothschild family. This is a rough translation from Google Translate. Quote, "As today, a loan cannot be negotiated in Europe without the goodwill of the Rothschilds, so soon you do not will not to be able to trafficate without the consent and interest of the Judaic International League." Unquote. What is ironic is how the Rothschilds have nothing but their own lack of foresight to blame for literature like this. We read from Jesuit scholar Robert Alexander Merckx that the Rothschild money loaned to the papacy was actually used to establish the very journal which attacked them as being leading international Jewish conspirators. Quote, "This bi-weekly periodical was censored by the Vatican Secretariat of State and was considered an official expression of the Vatican's views. As David Kurtzer has persuasively shown, La Civiltà Cattolica's anti-Jewish campaign, coming when it did, proved crucial to the rise of modern anti-Semitism. Indeed, already in the early years, 1865 to 68, of the pontificate of Pius IX, who helped found the periodical in 1850 with funds he borrowed from the Jewish Rothschild banking family in Naples, the Jesuits published 36 fiercely anti-Semitic articles. In Kurtzer's well-argued view, the Church, and especially the Jesuit periodical, laid the groundwork for the fascist racial laws." Unquote.